Good evening. My name is Bill Kivich. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalists here at Harvard, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Annual Joe Elix Morris Memorial Lecture. Joe Elix Morris was a graduate of Harvard's class of '49, served as a foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, reporting from the Middle East for 25 years before he was killed while covering the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Joe Elix's family and classmates, led by Richard Stone, roommate here who's with us tonight, established this lecture in honor of his memory. When Joe Elix died, an Iranian newspaper, the Tehran Journal, memorialized him with this observation: Morris was respected for his fairness, his untiring quest for truth, his willingness to listen, to learn, to observe. We're fortunate tonight to have Jim Wooten, the senior correspondent for ABC Television News, another journalist who exhibits those same qualities, to deliver our 14th Joe Elix Morris Memorial Lecture. Jim Wooten began his career in journalism on a weekly newspaper in rural West Tennessee in the early 1960s. His sensitive and thoughtful reporting on Southern mores and culture soon captured the attention of the New York Times. And when he joined the New York Times in 1968, the readers of that newspaper were treated to a sustained period of coverage of the changing Southern society and politics in all of its nuance and complexity. His profiles of Southern politicians like George Wallace and Jimmy Carter quickly became the benchmark for other reporters. In 1973, Jim's reporting on the Arab-Israeli War won him the Ernie Pyle Memorial Medal. His coverage of the 1976 presidential campaign for the New York Times was later recorded in a book on the roots and the rising of Jimmy Carter. Since joining ABC Television News, Jim has continued his national political reporting. He's currently involved in his 7th national presidential campaign, but he has also spent much time abroad. He has reported for World News Tonight and Nightline and other ABC news programs from 25 countries on 5 continents. In 1991, he was a combat correspondent during the Gulf War, reporting on the U.S. Army's 3rd Armored Division advance into southern Iraq, and a few weeks later was in northern Iraq covering the Kurdish rebellion and its aftermath. In 1993, he covered the war in Bosnia and returned there early this year to report on former President Jimmy Carter's eventually unsuccessful efforts to achieve a permanent ceasefire in that war. Last year, he filed a series of compelling reports on the slaughter in Rwanda. A complete journalist with a storyteller's ear, on each of these assignments, Jim's powerful visual stories have been followed by graceful and compelling written reports which appear in publications such as the New York Times Sunday Magazine. Just last week, he was recognized by his journalistic peers when he was given the Overseas Press Club Award for his reporting from Rwanda, and tonight I've just learned that he has been awarded the Robert Kennedy Award for the same stories. Please join me in welcoming our 14th Annual Joe Elix Morris Lecturer, Jim Wooten.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, I was asked to cover the unveiling of a statue of Merle Travis in South Central Kentucky. For those of you who are culturally disadvantaged, Merle Travis was a wonderful writer of songs like 16 Tons and Dark as a Dungeon, songs about the coal mine country. He was also a very terrible man, a drinker, I believe, who had more ex-wives than hit songs and more alimony than royalties. So when the statue was unveiled and Mr. Travis teetered over to it and stood next to this granite likeness of his own self. He looked out on the crowd with these bleary, whiskied eyes, and this is what he said. "Well, I didn't bring my guitar, but if you'd like, I can beat on my wife for a while." Well, Mr. Travis and I have a great deal in common. I did not bring my guitar, and my wife is here, but in lieu of beating up on her, I do want you to meet her. Patience O'Connor, would you stand up, hon? And my last daughter, Lacey. Stand up, Lace. Thank you. That really is a true story. I printed up this speech in TV prompter type, so I can, and I still can't read it, so I'm sorry. I was and I am quite literally astonished by your invitation, and it is very, very difficult to express how much this moment does mean to me. So I'll tell you quite simply and most sincerely that I'm deeply honored and genuinely grateful and very nervous. That's because there is here a premise that's implicit in this gathering, which is this, that something worth hearing is about to be said. With all due respect to those who've conferred this lectureship, that's not necessarily true, and I believe I'm about to demonstrate that it's false. This is not modesty. I'm very proud of what I do and what I've done. But there is a vast and considerable difference between doing it and discussing it. And I understand that difference, and I understand that all of you understand that difference too, which is what scares the bejesus out of me. Clearly you know who I am, not because you know me personally, though some of you do, but because many of you are also reporters, or by one means or another are well acquainted with the beast, and you have no doubt learned from personal experience that our copy is generally a lot better than our speeches. So I'd be just as happy to read some of my stories or scripts here tonight, but that's not done. This, after all, is a lecture. So the good news is, not having much to say otherwise, it won't take very long to say it. After all, the reporter's credentials are not automatic proof of either wit or wisdom, nor are they a license to pronounce judgments on the craft or the culture. And they're no certificate of special status or stature. And every time I find myself behaving as though my press pass qualifies me for membership in some elite stratum of society, I have only to remember a Sunday afternoon in the Middle East several years ago. I was in Amman for a live interview with King Hussein, and as we chatted before the broadcast, which is this week with David Brinkley, it occurred to me that I had come a long way from Alabama, from covering cops and robbers in Huntsville or George Wallace and the state legislature down in Montgomery, and I was eminently pleased with myself to be sitting there knee to knee in the palace with the ruler of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, trading small talk about our families and our hobbies. "And would you care for something to drink?" His Majesty asked. I said, "That's very kind of you. Some water would be fine." And he snapped his fingers, literally, and a young fellow materialized from someplace, carrying a silver tray on which were balanced an unopened bottle of Evian, a Waterford goblet for the king, and for me, a styrofoam cup. So much for how far I'd come from Huntsville. That was a useful moment, and so was this one. Several years ago, I was scrunched up in a corner of a plane waiting to take off from Istanbul, and waiting for several other passengers to board, and an American woman, a tourist no doubt, elderly woman, walked down the aisle, passed by my aisle, stopped, backed up, and looked at me and said, "I recognize you. You're on television. What's your name?" And I said, "It's Jim Wooten with ABC." She said, "No, no, 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 no." And she went on down the aisle. And that was another useful moment. And late one February morning in 1991, somewhere in southern Iraq, the armored battalion to which I'd attached myself thundered over a rise into the middle of a large Bedouin encampment. After 40 hours of nearly constant combat chasing Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, everybody in the battalion welcomed the meandering flocks and herds, if for no other reason than as a logical assurance that for the next few kilometers at least there were no landmines. The cameraman and I crawled down from an APC, and while he rolled on those predictable pictures, you know, the great and mighty American war machine moving carefully through these bucolic herds of camels and sheep and goats, I was soon joined by a little boy from one of the tents. And I smiled, and he smiled, and after a while he took my hand. And the cameraman noticed us strolling along in the desert and swung around to get the shot, and the kid noticed the camera, and he pointed to it and he said, "CNN?" I said, "ABC." No, he said, "CNN." Another useful moment. Now, for reporters, the moral to this little trilogy is fairly simple. It doesn't matter who we are or where we came from or what our names are. It doesn't matter for whom we work. What really matters is the work. And the work is always and ever the story. Finding it, getting it, writing it, filing it, airing it. That's what's important about reporters, their stories. Years ago in my job interview at the New York Times, Mr. E. Clifton Daniel gazed studiously across the polished expanse of the managing editor's desk and somberly asked me exactly what sort of stories I'd like to cover for his newspaper. "Well, sir," I said, "I'd prefer all the big ones." Mr. E. Clifton Daniel did not crack a smile, but he did hire me. And although I didn't get all the big ones, Kovich here got his hands on a few, I did manage to get enough of them to keep me happy and humble. In 1974, for instance, when Jerry Ford nominated him to be vice president, Nelson Rockefeller was holed up in his little seaside hovel in Seal Harbor, Maine. And while I was there covering the man, I wrote a little story about the place, called it quiet and comfortable, an understated summer retreat for such prominent Americans as the late Walter Lippmann. As it turned out, Mr. Lippmann was not quite dead. This was a useful moment in my career. And in January of 1977, writing the inauguration story from Washington, I told our readers at the Times how the shops and stores along Constitution Avenue were all closed and shuttered for the big day. If you want to be picky about it, there are no shops and stores on Constitution Avenue, proving once again that you don't have to be a genius to work the big ones for the Times. These are clearly examples of ignorance, my ignorance, but not the sort of ignorance that Homer Biggert liked to recommend as the reporter's proper perspective on any story. What he meant, of course, is that we ought to strip ourselves of any notion that we understand the story before we report it. Last summer in Rwanda, I kept running into a reporter who also happened to be an MD, who said repeatedly to me and anybody else who'd listen that there was no cholera in those teeming camps. "I've seen cholera plenty of times," he said. "I've seen cholera in Bangladesh, and I've seen cholera in Pakistan, and I've seen cholera all over Africa, and I'm telling you, boys, there ain't no cholera here." It is not particularly funny, but it is ironic that the only reporter there who contracted cholera was the doctor. He was clearly not enrolled in Homer Biggert's school of portable ignorance. I know it sounds like heresy or even hard work, Homer liked to say, but you have to ask questions, the answers to which you do not know. Biggert was one of my heroes, still is, though he is not in my eldest daughter's pantheon. When she was very young and studying beginning French, she came to dinner one evening with me and with Homer, who had forgotten his glasses, and in the dim candlelight couldn't read his menu. Karen, little Karen, seated next to him, happily volunteered her services and, scanning the appetizers, heartily recommended the coquille Saint-Jacques. "C'est bon, Monsieur Bigot," she said. "C'est bon, très bon." Homer eyed her suspiciously over his martini. "My dear young lady," he growled, "in Atlanta, Georgia, in a restaurant called the Old Red Barn, the coquille Saint-Jacques is never très bon." Now, what Homer lacked in child psychology or common courtesy, he more than compensated for in his total commitment to the story. There were many prestigious awards for him, of course, the Pulitzer, the Overseas Press Club, and others, but over 40 years of work, the only prize that really mattered to Homer was the story. Not the last one and not the next one, but the one he was pursuing at the moment. And that's what made him such a magnificent reporter, maybe the best of his generation, the kind of reporter about whom stories are told, whenever and wherever reporters gather. During the Korean War, for instance, the Herald Tribune sent both Biggert and his arch-rival, arch-enemy, Maggie Higgins, to cover it. And for more than a year, they competed savagely for page one. And after the war was over, when someone told Homer that Maggie Higgins had married and had a baby, Homer asked, stuttering as usual, who was the mother? There's even a song about Homer, written by none other than Mr. E. Clifton Daniel himself. I thought I'd probably be the only one here tonight who'd ever heard him sing it. It was in a crowded apartment on the west side of Manhattan at a wake for Harrison Salisbury. And late in the liquid evening, after all the toasts and all the stories, there suddenly rose from near the fireplace a clear and confident baritone singing the words he'd written nearly 50 years before in a place called Palestine. Rabbi Homer Biggert's sending out the news of how the bloody British are beating up the Jews. I thought I would sing it. The host that night was David Halberstam. He now regards that moment as one of the high points in his worthless life. That most unlikely moment, most unlikely in which in his very own living room, Mr. E. Clifton Daniel let down his beautiful white hair and sang a song about Homer Biggert. What a country. And what a business this is, this craft or this vocation or whatever the hell it is, in which ordinary folks like Homer Biggert and Harrison Salisbury and a man named Charlie Moore, who taught my wife how to play poker and shamelessly took our money while she was learning. Ordinary people like Biggert and Salisbury and Charlie Moore and Joe Morris could make such extraordinary contributions to their time simply by being good reporters. They were all flawed creatures, of course, unlike the rest of us, with numerous vices and weaknesses, but the flame of their lives was always and ever the story. And whatever their faults, whatever Homer did to Karen, I miss them. I miss their instinct, and I miss their edge, and I miss their attitude, but maybe most of all, I miss the voice of their work. And sometimes, I have to say, I come precariously close to believing that the passing of reporters like them has left an awkward and awful silence in our business. That isn't true. I don't really believe that. There are plenty of good reporters around these days, and some are no doubt as good as they were and maybe even better. But what is true, or at least what I believe is true, is that the voices of good reporters are much more difficult to hear nowadays. Contemporary media, print and electronic, written and spoken, radio and television, movies, newspapers, magazines, entertainment news, network and local, it's all become a veritable Tower of Babel, the constant source of thousands of competing ideas and images offered not in the name of democratic diversity or free speech, but for pure profit. Most of it's bilge, eyewash, tabloid trash, but it is there, and it is always there now, inescapably noisy, mainlined into the mainstream ethos of our country and our culture, with such forceful repetitiveness that the voices of good reporters, their ideas, their images, their stories can hardly be heard. The result of all this is either the absence of truth, or perhaps more pernicious, the widespread persuasion that there is no truth, or at least none that really matters, that it's all really a matter of opinion, point of view, perspective. This is a problem of dilution, the difference between a martini made at 3-to-1 or 8-to-1. And it is most clearly seen in the claim and the widespread acceptance of people like Geraldo Rivera and Jerry Springer and Larry King and John McLaughlin that they are journalists, operating within the purview and the protection of the First Amendment, which I think is the last refuge of the media scoundrel. This instant fallback on these vague perimeters of the Constitution, this instant response to any critique of what they do is, I'm a journalist. Now, there's really nothing to do about it except to act on our basic understanding and our instincts that they do not belong to our fraternity. And to say that as often as the opportunity arises, because the problem is a confusion of identities. They are not reporters, they're not journalists, and the more often we say that in print, on the air, in the public, the better off everybody is. It doesn't solve the problem entirely, doesn't even begin to solve the problem, but it does provide a small inroad. And besides, it makes me feel good to say it. After all, the very lodestone of what we do as journalists, as reporters and editors and correspondents and producers, the irreducible bedrock of our work is the assumption that truth does exist, if only in the context of a passing moment, and that in that moment it can be cornered, corralled, captured, and explained, and that we're just the folks to do it. That is our theology. We are self-appointed, yes, and yes, we're self-selected. But that's what matters about us, the one characteristic that separates us from all that noise out there. Not merely that we have the confidence to take on this job, but the skill and the brains and the grit to do it. That's who we think we are, isn't it? And that's who we have to be, which is reason enough for pride and maybe from time to time a little arrogance. Unfortunately, what's happened in our tribe all over the country is the proliferation of arrogance based on a myth. It is the myth of celebrity, I think, most often passed along and perpetuated by people in my business, but also even by newspaper people who get infected by the cholera of television exposure. It is the sense that one single and specific journalist, reporter, columnist, whatever, is special simply by virtue of being noticed or by virtue of notoriety. It is this false notion, it is the false notion that what this is all about, what we do and why we do it, is to be noticed, to be famous. Not more than a month ago at Emory University in Atlanta, which is the home of the old red barn where the Coquille Saint-Jacques is never très bon, I addressed a gathering of student journalists from all over the Southeast, about 250 young people. And as many of them as I could, I asked that same question that Mr. E. Clifton Daniel asked me so many years ago: what stories do you want to cover? Almost every single one of them said they wanted to be an anchor. Almost every single one said they wanted to sit in a chair under the lights and read the words that rolled in front of them. Almost none of those young people saw the years ahead as an opportunity to find stories and tell them. Their careers, for them, were simply opportunities. I know I spent considerable time on Biggert and Salisbury and Charlie Moore, but the fact of the matter is we're probably better now than they were. Better educated, better trained, and certainly better equipped. My Lord, in that respect alone, what we can do, we are light years ahead of the old guys. Not long ago, one bloody afternoon in Mogadishu, in the middle of a fierce and ferocious firefight with hundreds of pieces of metal filling the air, Ray Bonner, of the New York Times came jumping into our, about to say bureau, it was the bunker really, and he wanted to borrow our satellite phone. I watched him. With one hand, he plugged in his laptop, and with the other, he hit a magic key. And in seconds, his entire story, down to the very last comma, was at 229 West 43rd Street, New York City, 10036. Have you seen these satellite phones, by the way? It's an attaché case, that's all. Even I can set it up. Ray Bonner can use it too, because when he was finished in the midst of all this shelling, I remember yelling him this story. In 1968, after Wallace had chosen Curtis LeMay as his vice presidential candidate, and LeMay had returned the favor by suggesting that maybe the U.S. ought to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, there was a sort of emergency summit of all of the right-wing nutsos and crazies in the whole country, and they all gathered in Roanoke, Virginia. That was the only time, by the way, I ever met Leander Perez, who is reputed to have said to Wallace, "What you going to do now, George? The commies have got the A-bomb." You know. But in writing the story for the Times that afternoon, I described their rendezvous as having taken place in the old Hotel Roanoke, quote, a sprawling Tudor mansion built by the railroad at the turn of the century. But unlike Ray Bonner with his magic finger on the magic button, we Times reporters in those days read the text of our stories over the telephone into a dictation room at West 43rd Street. And inevitably, the next morning on the front page of the New York Times, the old Hotel Roanoke had become a sprawling two-door mansion. We don't have that problem now. It's the 90s. Not long ago, my network broadcast live from Mount Everest. The climber took 4 pounds of equipment with him, set it up in 5 minutes, and went on Nightline. Remember that? Yeah. The point here is quite simply to say that we have to use these breathtaking advances and advantages we have over all those old guys, now dead and gone, to overcome the problems of our own moment. We're not going to tear down that Tower of Babel, but we can make damn certain that the best voices in our fraternity, sorority, can be heard and noticed. Some of you are or will be editors with power, muscle, and control. Find the reporters with the best and the clearest voices, with the edge and the attitude and the instinct, and give them a platform and turn up the volume. Give them a shot at being read or heard. And if you have the muscle, use some of it to identify who we are and what we do. Don't give your readers, your listeners, your viewers a chance to be confused about the difference between Ray Bonner and Geraldo Rivera. And if they're confused, beat them over the head with the difference. Reporters can't do that. Publishers won't, and editors can. Make certain you tell your audience what you're doing and why you're doing it and who's doing it and why they're the best people for the job, even if they did select themselves. Don't give people a chance to believe or assume otherwise. Back in the 50s, when the KGB had a meaningful relationship with every Western reporter in Moscow, the Americans, who all lived in the same apartment, played a lot of poker in a small basement cubicle illuminated by a single light bulb, and as everybody assumed, stereophonically bugged. One night, when all the veterans in the game were bitching and moaning about the surveillance, a nervous newcomer, quite uncomfortable and a bit intimidated, leaned forward between hands and said, "You know, I really sort of like Moscow. I really do. And this is Irving R. Levine, NBC News." The story is no doubt apocryphal. After all, it came from Hughes Rudd, so you have to. But the point is undiminished. We must, without embarrassment, identify ourselves, who we are, what we do, why we do it, and why we're the best folks to do it. We are the folks who've appointed ourselves to find and tell as much of the truth as is possible in one given moment, in one given day, and we can damn well do the job. It seems to me that whatever it takes to separate us from hard copy and current affair and Oprah and Phil and Maury and Jerry and Sally and whatever, all that dribble, it's worth it, whatever it takes. Last story. In the autumn of '73, during the Yom Kippur War, I returned to Tel Aviv from 3 or 4 days at the front in the Golan Heights. I was hungry, dirty, unshaven, unshowered, and still frightened half out of my wits. I had never been under such intense artillery before or since. And in my hotel lobby, I happened across an internationally famous, well-connected Washington columnist who was wearing a spiffy beige linen suit and was nice enough to invite me to dinner that night at the residence of the American ambassador to Israel, the former New York Senator Kenneth Keating. "I know he'd want to talk to you, Jim," the columnist said. "So get cleaned up and come on along." I declined, but the columnist was reluctant to take no for an answer and insisted. I continued to resist, and he finally said, in right angry exasperation, "How the hell can you expect to cover this war if you don't talk to the ambassador? And besides, he has a lovely terrace. Over cocktails, it's the best place to be in Tel Aviv." I suppose what he meant was that there's more to a war than the fighting, which is true, of course. But when eventually I did sit down with the ambassador a few days later in his office, not the terrace, he flat out lied to me. Either that or he passed along without knowing it one of Nixon's or Kissinger's many fabrications. But I attributed what Ken Keating told me that day to knowledgeable background sources and put it in the New York Times more or less as the gospel truth. I got over it, and so did the Times. But the moment has become a part of my recitation of There Are No Rules in Journalism, a few suggestions for being a reporter, the first of which is obviously stolen. One, on every story, start out ignorant, which is different from stupid. Don't be Forrest Gump, be Homer Bigger, or more contemporaneously, be John Kiffner, whose first question on any assignment is always, "What is this?" expletive deleted. Ask questions, the answers to which you don't know. 2, a bit of arrogance is okay. You could strut. You're a reporter. After all, you've appointed yourself as an agent of the truth. Not bad. It's a noble and an honorable pursuit. 3, listen to your peers, but pay absolutely no attention to criticism from politicians. Even if they're sometimes right, they are always wrong. There are notable exceptions, of course, but by and large, they don't much care about the truth, and they're never really happy with what we do. They just pretend from time to time, and it's not worth the trouble to listen. Next, be comfortably ill at ease. Enjoy being an outsider. It's the best place to do your work. Next, wander. Be a gypsy. An itinerant, even if you don't travel the world and even if you don't move from city to city in this country. I mean by this, don't stay too long on the same assignment. Move around. Look for a fresh batch of ignorance. 6, know when to leave. I had 2 stories killed at the New York Times. Rosenthal said, "I want you to cover Washington like a foreign correspondent. I want you to pretend that you're writing for readership in London." So one day, I went up to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I took down phonetically everything that Strom Thurmond said and then translated it into English. That was my story, and they killed the story, which is understandable. The second story that they killed was a story about drug use by reporters with White House people. They killed that story, and I knew that story was true, and that's when I left. I think you have to know when to leave. Speaking of translators, this has nothing to do with anything, but I have to tell you this story. Curtis Wilkie, who writes for your local paper, is one of the great men in the world, who is probably, is Tom Winship here? Is Tom coming? Tom left just in time because Wilkie walked in there and conned these people at the Globe into believing that there are great and momentous events to cover in New Orleans, Louisiana, you know? Well, Curtis, years ago when the TWA plane was hijacked and was in Beirut, there was a man named Wally Jumblatt, who was a Druze, who was a spokesman for everybody, it seemed like. So there was a big press conference and hundreds of reporters of all nationalities, and they had several translators, because Walid was speaking in Arabic, and so you had a translator over here who was translating Arabic into English, and one over here was translating into French, and one over here was translating Arabic into German, and then a question would come in German, and it would all be translated back and everything. And so Curtis Wilkie was sitting on the front row, and Curtis Wilkie, who's from Mississippi, said, Mr. Jumblatt, you want to tell me what you think about, this thing, woman, you do, playing of a down, thing. And all of the translators stood there, because absolutely none of them had ever heard this language spoken before. Well, I'm sorry to do that. Yeah. But at any rate, the point was know when to leave, know when to move along. The papers and the networks and the magazines don't own your body, and they don't own your soul. Demand that you get treated right, and know when to walk. Next, I think this is 7. You need to get an edge and keep it. Make it count. You don't necessarily have to be an adversary or an enemy of anybody or anything, but you certainly can't be an advocate. And you certainly have to when you raise your voice, you ought to have something to say, and there ought to be an edge in it. Don't be timid, and don't be dull. Get an edge. 9, commit to the adventure. Journalism, especially reporting, is precisely that. It is an ignorant, pitch-dark step into the unknown. If you're not willing to trust your instincts and your attitude and your edge, if you shrink back from that step, get a real job. Be a lawyer. And finally, don't talk to ambassadors on their terraces or anywhere else. Generally speaking, it's a waste of time. I hope this wasn't for you, but even if it was, I insist that I was deeply honored by your invitation and happy and proud to be asked. It was an adventure. Thank you. In announcing my candidacy, we have some microphones set up, and I understand it's a tradition of these moments to take questions. So when you come to the microphone, identify yourself and don't ask hard questions. Okay, young man.
Good evening, Mr. Hooten. My name is Daniel Allen. Really excited to have you here. Admire your work very much, especially your work in Rwanda a couple of months ago. Over the summer. I wanted to ask you a question about international news, since I know you've covered a lot of that. I've noticed over the last couple of years, since Clinton has taken office, that there is a remarkable downturn in the number of stories that, international stories that are broadcast on the networks. I believe that ABC, for example, on the evening news, the world news, there were about 4 stories a night coming out of London until about 2 years ago, and now they're lucky to have more than 1. What do you think about this? Is this a reflection on the net lack of interest on the American public, or Bill Clinton's try to...
I don't want to suggest that your premise is false, but I'm not sure it's true. I bet you that it's an impression rather than a reality, that it's happened during the Clinton administration. I think the fact of the matter is that foreign news on the networks has been diminishing over a long period of time, and not just because this fellow from Arkansas is president. Foreign news, unless it's absolutely spectacular and absolutely critical, always gets pushed out by domestic news. And so when you have a great run of a president who's controversial, then that's going to happen. And I expect we put as much foreign news on as anybody else, which is not enough. but what it does also reflect, and we discussed that this afternoon, what it does reflect is that people don't care anyway. So, and a lot of network broadcasts, not all of them, a lot of network broadcasts are put together on the premise of what do the people care about, what do they want to see, not necessarily what do they need to see. And I know I didn't answer your question, but I hope I explained a little bit of it.
Given that there's no one else at the other microphones, let me
Yeah.
continue in
Go
that
with
case.
it, pal. Go with it. You got the mic.
I was, I mean, just to follow up on what you were saying, I wasn't suggesting by any means that ABC has less news, but I was wondering about this downward trend in the number of stories. Do you think it's budget cuts on the part of the networks, or is it just lack of interest on the American public? You said that there was
There is a lack of interest, and it may indeed be a product of fiscal squeeze of some kind. I just don't know if what you're saying is true, so I don't know how to comment on that. I would think that, you know, any foreign story that we think has some moment and weight, we put it on, or we go and we get it. I'm not aware of foreign. Is there a foreign story that wasn't on that you wanted to see, that you read in the Times?
No, actually, no.
Okay, all right. Okay,
But thank you.
Thank you, yes.
Hi, my name is Ned Reynolds, and I'm a first-year public policy student here. It was pretty clear from your remarks that you take a dim view of journalists who revel in their celebrity and who have gone from seeking the story and searching for the truth to just voicing their opinion. But one of the key attributes for journalists that you advocated was having an edge and an attitude. Could you elaborate on those characteristics, what you mean by those characteristics?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. The edge is basically I'm here to do a job. Get out of the way. That's what I mean by an edge. It doesn't mean I'm here to do a job on you, or on Clinton, or I'm here to do a job on Gingrich, or on that great giant of the Western civilization, Congressman Bob Dornan, who, thank God, has announced his presidential candidacy today. You know, you don't. The edge is not as an advocate or as an adversary. The edge is the energy. The attitude is basically the same. You know, I'm using the same word for the same thing. You take a guy like Homer Biggert, whom I raised, or a guy like Charlie Moore, whose name I raised. I don't know that all of you know who Charlie Moore was, but he was really one of the finest reporters that I ever knew. But his attitude was, look, Charlie once told me something that he had said to an LTC in Vietnam, who didn't want him hanging around his battalion. He said to him, look, Colonel, you are here in the name of the United States government, yes, and I am here to tell the people of the United States what it is you're doing in their name. I always thought that really sort of crystallized the attitude, not for a war, or not for floods or anything, for covering the city council and the zoning board. I'm here to tell the people what it is you're doing in their name. That's the attitude. That's the edge I'm talking about. Opinions, you know, I mean, the opinions are people like, and I'm not, you know, there are editorials and there are columnists and there are opinions. Fine, that's not what I do, and I think that's not what we do. Yeah. Did I answer you?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Mr. Wooten, I'm David Moran. I'm a visitor to Cambridge from Silver Spring, Maryland. I applaud the refreshing nature with which you bring to light some of the deficits of current reporting. And I also consider myself to be one of the great cynics with regard to the believability of some of the information we receive from the press these days. What should we cynics look for in the future in terms of bringing us back to absorbing and accepting and hopefully believing.
Don't
the
watch
outcome.
television magazine shows.
Yes, well, I don't, but
Okay.
what else
Read the
should
New York Times. Read the New York Times. Don't watch television magazine shows. And trust your instincts. I don't know what else to tell you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Dan Nussbaum, also a visitor and here at the Kennedy School. Yeah, I'm sure you have a little bag packed in the corner for the next war. And,
Well, I don't
where
know.
do you expect it and you to go?
I said, I always say to patients every time, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. And she says, right, every time. That's basically her response. I don't know. A war that matters, I mean, certainly the war in the former Yugoslavia is going to go on and on. It seems to me that will probably escalate again, that will present itself once again, either as a problem to be dealt with or, as in the past, a problem to be ignored. Seems to me that that what you're going to have in sub-Saharan Africa is a continuation of small wars, and that we can also, from the standpoint of policy, we can ignore those, and will, no doubt. I don't know. I think that relations between Georgia and Alabama have reached a point where that's going to be okay for a while. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a chemical engineer. I don't question that journalists tell the truth, as you claim, but somebody must decide what to tell the truth about. You can't tell the truth about everything. In other words, what to cover, what not to cover. Can you deal a little bit more with how that happens? Who decides? I wonder whether survival in the business or promotion depends on telling the truth about the right subjects. Who do you have to please?
I don't know. I've never had to please anybody, and I wouldn't think that really is a part of the formula for success in the business would be pleasing. The assignments are always subjective. I mean, there are some things that are automatic. You cover the White House, you cover the Congress, you cover the Pentagon, et cetera.
The public demands certain things.
Well, yeah. Well, I don't know that the public demands it, or not. But I mean, that's our responsibility. Would be those centers of government power and activity clearly need to be watched very closely and reported on regularly. Those are mandatory assignments. A lot of assignments are discretionary. In other words, if you didn't see this story in the paper, you would never know that you missed it, if that makes any sense.
Well, yes, but I'm thinking in terms of selective enforcement. There are a lot of cases, for example, in environmentalism, where a great many people are in violation, but only a few get prosecuted, and then the question is, how does the prosecutor decide who to prosecute? He has an agenda. He wants to create a climate or whatever. It seems to me the same thing could happen in journalism, even legitimate journalism, aside from, not
exactly
ambush journalism. Doesn't that kind of thing play a part in what gets covered?
Not that I know of.
Would you? Sorry to be so
cynical,
but would you know? Would you know? How would you know?
I think I would know. I mean, what is our agenda, for instance? I don't know a lot about journalism in general, sir. But I do know a lot about my network, and I do know a lot about the New York Times. It's not my, it was never my experience that there was, in a way that affected me or affected other reporters, an agenda there.
And do conservative reporters feel the same?
I don't really know.
Okay, thank you.
I don't really know. The lady from Tanzania approaches the mic.
Well, I saw Mike there first, so I don't know.
I think let's hear from you.
Okay, sure. I'm just curious to know, when you go into the foreign countries, those people, they speak foreign languages and what, how far are you sure that the translators are telling you what the people are really saying? Because oftentimes a lot of translators, they don't tell you what the people are really saying. They want to hide the truth, maybe. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that a couple of minutes ago, I think you sounded pretty negative about Africa, and I was wondering if you realized that most of the problems in Africa were caused by the colonial powers, and they're still being caused by the colonial powers. And for example, the case of Rwanda and Burundi, all those problems were caused by the French, who treated the Tutsis like kings, queens, and princesses, and the Hutus like the slaves. And that's passed over into their, you know, so but that's just what I want to say, so.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Two questions. The first is, what was Curtis Wilkie's question?
Who the hell knows what Curtis Wilkie was asking?
And the second and more serious question is going back to your list of knowing when to leave. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more about what happened at the Times with you, and what are the telltale signs? When do you know when to leave and preserve your credibility and respect?
Oh, I don't know. They killed the story. That's all. I'm not trying to be cute about it. I mean, you just know. If they kill the story like that, I mean, killing a story about Strom Thurmond and, come on, that happens. And, maybe it wasn't a good idea to do that. And maybe I was on purpose gigging him, with this idiotic assignment to cover Washington like a foreign reporter. But the other was different. The other is different. And I mean, once they do that, then that's it. And I don't know how else to describe what occurred in that. I mean, it really hurt me, and I suppose there was a lot of pride involved, But I've never been sorry that I left. I miss working for newspapers, but I don't miss working for the Times. Yes?
Yeah, actually, I was still waiting to hear about the translators.
Oh, well, see, I don't have that problem because I speak Swahili and Bantu fluently, No, we tried very, very hard to avoid that kind of thing. I mean, we spend a lot of time on finding people that we trust. And usually, of course, there's no 100% safety net for that. But I don't believe we've ever been jiggered on that.
Do you use local reporters to gather information, or
We
do
do.
you get it from newspapers? Or?
We do. We interview people. We hire local reporters and to go with us and to travel with us. We hire translators and et cetera to help me with my Bantu and Swahili.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Bill.
Jim Kovich says that this is the last question. I always obey whatever he says. I don't have a question. I have an addendum to your Wilkie story, our mutual friend, since we all covered the '76 campaign together. And Joan Shorenstein Barone, whose name lives on in the Shorenstein Center here, approached me, may have asked you. I hear a lot about Curtis Wilkie out in the campaign. What do you think about him coming on television? I'm sure my mind and face went blank. Have you ever met Curtis Wilkie? And she said, no, but I hear he's great. He's really brilliant. He was taken on a show that Sunday, and the guest said 9 times, what did you say, sir? So Curtis has done it on continents everywhere.
That's right. That's right. I think we have. That's right. Yeah, that's right. David, you had a question. This is the last one.
Jim's colleague, David Halberstam, in whose apartment Clifton Daniel sang the Homer Bigart song. But I wondered if you would just talk to us a little bit, free associate, what it was like. I know you've covered so many stories, but what it was like to go to Rwanda and separate your human self and deal with your professional self in the face of a tragedy that must have been beyond anything you'd ever seen before. And I wonder if you could share that, the two parts of yourself and how you deal with that.
Well, thanks, David. You don't deal with it. I mean, you do deal with it. You have to deal with it, and you can't. You can't do your work if you don't deal with it. And the way I deal with it is, this absolutely makes no sense. Clearly, I'm stumped as to how to explain this. The way I deal with it is I do my work. You understand, first of all, that there is damn little you can do. I and others in my crew made arrangements to help as much as we could in a way that was safe for us. I mean, you couldn't take water and you couldn't take food into the camps, and et cetera, because you'd get killed. People wouldn't mean to kill you or hurt you or anything, but they would. You'd get killed. So we would make arrangements to feed people that way. I mean, that was one way that we answered the what little humanity there is that's left in a reporter, I suppose, after all. I guess that's what some people think anyway. And the rest of the time, we had to say, what we are seeing here, say to ourselves every morning, or at least this I say what I would say to myself every morning, this is the worst thing I have ever seen. This is the worst thing I've ever been around. I cannot do this today, but I have to tell this story. I know it sounds melodramatic, but every single morning I would say that to myself. You have to get through this day. You have to go out there in the camps. You have to watch them unload the bodies. You have to, and that is, but the conflict is there, the tension. I mean, it's not just tension. I mean, it is a battle, because your instinct is, because you're a human being, your instinct is you want to reach down. And you know how much I love babies and any babies anyway, and you want to reach down, you want to pick up this baby, and this baby's dying, and there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it. Not a thing. Nothing you can do. And you know that. And you know that. But still there is this instinct in it that you still want to try. You still want to try. And I'll tell you a brief story. We have a wonderful cameraman named Fletcher Johnson, who is about 6'5", with the hands the size of Michael Jordan's, and a wonderful shooter who was with me. And one afternoon, we came across some young boys, and they were gone. They were really gone. And maybe, I don't know if they were brothers or not. They couldn't talk even. And one's head was on the other's stomach, and they were lying in the road. And Fletcher was shooting them, his camera. And I was watching him, and he was down on his knees, and he had the camera like this. And he suddenly stopped, and he said, "This is expletive crazy. This is crazy." And we went to the car, to the truck, and we got all the water we had in there, got all the food we had, fine, and brought it out to these boys and tried to get some water down with the top of an Evian bottle, a little plastic up, trying to get it down there. And we stayed with them until they died. And as they died, then several others, 4 or 5 other boys over here died, to whom we'd given the food. The point being, yes, it was crazy. It was crazy, yes, it's crazy, The choice is not to go there. That's the choice. You don't go there, you don't do the story, you don't put it on because it's terrible. Or you choose to go there and deal with it and do it. And that's what I chose to do. And, but thank you very much for asking me. Thank you.